Acha ji. Assalamu alaikum. Now we continue with the development of the head and neck, and in that today we are going to talk about the development of the face, which is very much in relation with your oral cavity. So be very careful in listening to what all, and so it's very important. This picture that you see is just showing you how the development of the face takes place. Initially, these are the sites, or you can say the points where the this development starts. Then gradually they increase in size, they move their position, and then ultimately what you get is this position, and then the 10th week embryo or the final position, which is then gradually going to uh, shift to its original place. Now, what happens is in the development of the face, you get something at the inferior surface of the developing brain or the ventral portion of the developing brain. You develop certain primordia, that is, the sites from where the development of the face is going to start. On the face, there are going to be 5 facial primordia. They are called the facial primordia, or as you can say, the centers of ossification, the way you start with the development of the bone. In this case, these are the facial primordia, which are ultimately going to increase, decrease, or meet together and then form the face. So the 5 facial primordia, they start developing into the area, around the area what we originally called as at the interior and at the cephalic end of the developing embryo, that what we called as, which will become the stomodium, or which was as the buccopharyngeal membrane. Let me see if I have this up. If you see in this picture, in the upper one, that part is where you have these arches, and in front of that, below the developing eye, that is the point where you're going to have the stomodium, or the area which is going to develop into the oral cavity, and then it is going to open up, and it was guarded by the buccopharyngeal membrane. This buccopharyngeal membrane is going to rupture, where and then it's going to develop as into the respective parts of the oral cavity. So we are going to talk about that area. This is we were gradually, if you remember, we are just talking about or concentrating ourselves to the development of the area which is near to these pharyngeal arches, or you can say near to the pharynx. Now we are there at the upper end of the pharynx, where we have the development of the oral cavity, because this oral cavity is going to continue downward as the trachea or your food pipe. So that is the area we are talking about. And so we have 5 primordia, and if you see in this center, this dark black line, that is the area what we are going to call as the stomodium, or the point where your oral cavity is going to develop. This is initially blocked by, as we said when we talked about the 2 extensions, we said buccopharyngeal membrane on the interior end and the cloacal membrane on the posterior end. This cloacal membrane is going to be in relation with your developing anal cavity, and this buccopharyngeal membrane is the area where you're going to have your bucco is the oral, and pharyngeal is the part which is going to continue as the pharynx. So that is part, and this is going to develop into the oral cavity, and the cloacal part, that is going to develop into the proctodium, the lower portion, which combine together and they form the development of the anal canal. So this is the area where we are developing the face. So it starts in the 4th week. That is, first of the 5 is your single frontonasal, that is onto the frontal aspect. If you see, it has been labeled, and the nasal, that is something area ventromedial to the area near to the developing nose. If you see these black spots, that is the area where you have in the ventromedial aspect, that is the area where you're going to develop the, or these are the primordia for the developing of the nose. Eyes develops from the side, and gradually as the face increases in size and the development goes on, the position of the eye shifts forward to its front. So the initial portion that is there is the frontomedial. That is why it is called the frontonasal. Frontal is your part which is going to develop into the part of the nose and to the frontal prominence. And these small pits, these are the nasal pits or the olfactory pits. Then that is the frontonasal prominence. Then there are 2 prominences on each side. One is the maxillary prominence, one on each side, and then there are the paired mandibular prominences. This is exactly the region where you had your first pharyngeal arch. There again, we had the maxillary prominence and the mandibular cartilage and the maxillary arch. Right, so this is the same area we are talking about. So in that was giving rise to the muscles and the bone. This is going to give rise to the rest of the structures of the oral cavity, that is the cheek, the muscles, the nerves, all that. Okay, so it's that area near to the first arch. This, we said, mesenchyme of the head and neck is going to be contributed, majority part is by the neurotract cells. So this part you have the five prominences. One is the frontonasal, then you have these two orange ones, the maxillary ones on the either sides of the oral cavity, or what we call as the stomodium, and then you have the mandibular prominence, that is below that stomodial process. This is going to arise. These are ultimately going to progress forward. Then these small pits, they arise, or the depressions or the placoids, we call them, the thickenings that are there in the ectoderm, they arise, and these what we are called the nasal placoids. These nasal placoids, ultimately they are going to deepen down, and then we are going to label them as the nasal pits, right? So when these nasal pits, they form a depression, the side of the mesenchyme, that is going to be slightly raised. So that raising produces two folds, what we call as the blue one as the lateral nasal prominence, and the medial, the yellow one is the medial nasal prominence, because we have a pit in the center. So what is elevated on the margins is called as the medial and the lateral nasal prominences. Then how does this progress further? Now the frontonasal portion, that is, if you see in this, this is the maxillary. These are the two colors that I have shown. That is, the green one is your medial one, purple is your lateral process, and the red is the mandibular process. So you can all visualize how these different parts are going to be correlated with the development of the different parts of the face. So the face is developed from the frontonasal process, the upper part of the head fold, that is the fronto, it's going to form your forehead, that is the frontal part, and the nasal part of the frontonasal process, that is going to develop into the area where you are ultimately going to have your development of the nose. So you can say the frontal portion is going to develop into the dorsum of the nose, and then you have the tip of the nose, then these ala or the sides, and the septum. So respectively you are going to have these different, so those that is coming from the nasal process. The two processes, maxillary and mandibular, from the first arch, the frontal nasal process, forehead and the nose fusion, we'll talk about these. And if you see this, now this was the initial position, then gradually this is going to grow to medially. This maxillary prominence is going to grow medially. This grows medially. In growing medially, it is going to unite with the lateral and the medial one. As you grow medially, the maxillary process fuses with the lateral nasal province, and the medial one, medial nasal provinces, they meet. If you see in the third picture, they meet together, because they are also going to come closer to each other, coming onto the dorsal aspect of the nose, and the maxillary process is fusing with the lateral nasal process. Then if you see in the fourth picture, you can see that these medial nasal swellings, they have fused together and you have become one. That is this part which has become the fusion of the dorsal portion of the nose and the apex of the nose and the tip of the nose. And there is also going to be contribution from the frontal the nasal process of the nose. Then you see this lateral nasal process. This is going to form the lateral side and the ala of the nose that is developing. Then this is going to fuse with the green portion, that is your maxillary part. This maxillary part, as it comes forward, it pushes all these processes towards the center. This maxillary part is going to form your cheek, that is the cheek, and then you can see that it is fusing to the other maxillary process from the other side, and they are also fusing to the medial nasal process. So all this together is going to form this part of the upper lip, and it's going to develop into the maxilla, and it's going to develop into the upper lip. And then the mandible, which had the two mandibular processes, individually they were separate, and they fused together, and then they're going to give you the lower lip and the mandible. If you see this picture as it is progressing, you have the processes, that is the frontonasal process. Then you have these depressions, that is the medial nasal prominence, the lateral nasal prominence, the nasal pit, maxillary process, and the mandibular process. As these maxillary processes, they move forwards, these maxillary processes, they move forward, they are going to meet, and then what you have is that the medial one, they fuse together and they form the tip and the dorsum of the nose, along with some part of the dorsum of the nose is from the frontal prominence. And also this lateral nasal prominence, it fuses with that of the maxillary one, and then it forms the ala and the lateral wall of the nose. Whereas This and it also forms the maxilla, and the part when the two meet, this center portion, that is your medial nasal prominence with the maxillary prominence in the center, is going to form your philtrum. That is, it's going to form your upper lip, the maxilla, and the philtrum or the center of the nose. And the septum of the nose is also going to be formed by this medial nasal prominence. And the cheek, rest of the cheek is being developed from the maxillary process, and the lower portion, as you see, the mandibular process is going to give rise to your lower lip and the mandible. So if we recollect, stomodium is the is the portion, this black one, which is the part where you are going to develop the oral cavity. Rostral to it is your frontal nasal process. Lateral to it, you have the maxillary process, and below it, you have the mandibular process. And then on the ventral medial aspect, you have these nasal placodes. The lower jaw and the lip, two mandibular processes are going to meet together, and they're going to give you your mandible and the lower lip. The upper jaw and the upper lip laterally, maxillary prominences, they are going to move forwards. They're going to give rise to the medial nasal prominence, and the maxillary prominence, they're going to fuse, and they're going to give rise to the upper lip and also into this philtrum of the upper lip. That is the small portion which they have highlighted. That is the small portion where the medial nasal prominences meet, and they form this central portion where you see a sort of a cleft or a depression in the lip. So the upper lip and the cheek and small portion of the lateral part of the nose or the ala of the nose is going to all develop from the maxillary, fusing with that of the lateral, the two maxillary fusing with each other, and the two medial nasals fusing with together and forming this portion of the philtrum of the upper lip. Mandible, cheeks, upper part, maxillary prominences. Basically, cheeks are formed by that. So you have the mandibular processes fuse to meet the lower jaw and the lower lip. Very simple. Upper jaw and upper lip is by the maxillary prominences, and the philtrum, that is the central portion just below your nose, that is the medial nasal prominences, form the medial aspect, and slightly lateral to it is contributed by the maxillary process. And frenum, that is your small portion of the lip with which it is attached to, the lip is attached to inside to the jaw, that is also contributed by this medial nasal processes. Cheeks, the upper part is by the maxillary prominence. You can automatically fit into together where these processes are or the primordia are and what part they can give rise to. And the lower part is the mandibular prominence. So if you again recollect this stepwise, this is the initial position. Gradually the maxillary process, eyes are on the lateral side. They are moving forwards as the face is developing. You can see the maxillary process is coming forward. It's fusing with the lateral side of the nose, and it is fusing with the central portion. This is the philtrum, the yellow one. It is fusing with the medial nasal arch or the prominence, and this is forming the central portion where the two meet. They are forming the central portion of the philtrum, forming the upper lip and the upper jaw. So you gradually see, and as this is progressing forward, you can see the eyes which were started to develop on the lateral side, they are going to come forward. But keep one thing in mind, the development of the eye starts, and the ear, it starts from the level of the neck. That is, we were at the level of the first cleft. So that is where your ear starts to develop, and gradually as the whole of the face is developing, this development is going to lift up the ear to its original position. The eyes, they are initially developing on the lateral side, and gradually as the face forms, they are going to move forwards, and the nose comes into the middle. The two placodes, they are going to meet together and come as the median portion, and the eyes, they are going to shift to its ventral portion. So you can see in these pictures gradually the stepwise position which is taking its place. Again, this picture shows you the different steps. These are the nasal process, that is the frontonasal, the maxillary and the mandibular. They are separate. In the center, you have the buccopharyngeal membrane, this purplish which is there. This is going to rupture and give rise to the stomodium. Then in the B, you can see that the buccopharyngeal membrane, the black one, has ruptured, and this has become the area, the stomodium. Then you see on the sides of it, lateral to the stomodium, you have the maxillary process. Inferior to it, you have the mandibular process. Above, you have the frontonasal. And then you have these pits which are there. Initial, that was your nasal placard which starts to develop. This is going to give rise to placard is just a thickening in the surface ectoderm. This then deepens to form the nasal pit. When it deepens, the mesenchyme around it forms these folds, which are your medial nasal and the lateral nasal folds. This gradually shifts. If you see in the C picture, this is shifting. The medial process is coming more forwards. You can see the the maxillary process shifting more medially, and they have fused. The mandibular process has fused. The medial nasal process, they have fused with each other, and they're gradually fusing with the lateral, and the medial, they are fusing with the maxillary process as well. So you can now see that the medial is ultimately fused with each other. The maxillary process is fused with the lateral nasal process, forming part of the cheek as well, and also some part of the lateral part of the nose. So you see in this picture stepwise how these folds, they are going to move, and as they move, they are going to take their final position. So now what we say is the final derivatives, what are the prominences we have and what are the derivatives each is going to give rise to. The frontonasal prominence, that is the frontal to the brain and to the nasal portion, that is where you have these nasal placards. That is going to give rise to your forehead, that is the front of the face. Then the bridge of the nose, that is your dorsum of the nose. The medial and the lateral prominences, they are going to form. The medial nasal prominence, that is going to give rise, as we've said, when they fuse together in the center, they are going to give rise to something what we called as the philtrum. If you see in this, the two medial nasal prominences, they have fused in the center, and they have formed the philtrum, and these nasal also form the dorsum of the nose along with the portion of the frontonasal prominence. Okay? This also is going to contribute to the primary palate. Now, the development of the palate is in two processes, the primary and the secondary palate. This primary palate, which has just the incisors and associated small portion of the teeth related to it, that is going to be contributed. That gives you a pre-maxilla that is developing from the medial nasal. So on the inner surface or the posterior surface of this medial nasal fold, you're going to have a projection which is called the pre-maxilla, and that is going to give rise to your primary palate. We're going to talk about it when we talk about the development of the palate. Okay, so the philtrum, that is the cleft that you see in the middle line below the nose and in the upper lip, that is going to develop from the medial nasal and the primary palate. The lateral nasal is going to give rise to the sides of the nose, that is what we call as the ala of the nose, that is going to be developed from the lateral nasal. If you see in this picture, these all blue is the side of the nose, or what we call as the ala of the nose, that is all developing from the lateral nasal process. Then you have the maxillary or the first pharyngeal arch, that is going to give rise to your cheek. The lateral part of the upper lip, the secondary palate, also contributes posteriorly, that is on the inner side. This secondary, the maxillary process is going to give rise to two folds on the sides of the tongue, which are then, the tongue is going to be at a higher level, which is then going to descend down, and these folds which are vertical, then they are going to ascend upwards, and they are going to meet as your secondary palate. That is going to be contributed by this maxillary process and the lateral part of the upper jaw. So all this is going to be by the maxillary process. And then you have the mandibular process, which gives rise to the lower lip and the lower jaw. So these are basically the derivatives. So you have formed the forehead, you form the boundaries of the nose, you have formed the cheek, you have formed some contribution to the palate, you have formed the upper lip, you have formed the lower lip, and the mandible plus the maxilla. So if you see this, how what each part is contributing, this from above, the frontonasal process by the medial, that is contributing to the part of the septum of the nose inside, and also to this dorsum of the nose, which is also being contributed from above from the frontonasal primordium. Then this is the maxillary process, which is forming your maxilla on the right side, and the lateral portion of the upper part of the lip. This is also in the center, the two medial nasal fuse, prominences fuse along with the this maxillary process, and they form this central portion, that is what we call as your globular process, and which is ultimately going to give rise to your philtrum. And then these two portions, this is your mandibular arch, which is going to give rise to your mandible and your lower lip. So this, as you can see, is the part where we had the first arch. This is then below the second and the third arch, and then the fourth and the sixth arches. So now you can understand exactly at what level we are talking about. And this picture also shows what part is developing from where, and then it is the nerve supply also, which is ultimately going to be related to it. So this picture shows you the first one, the yellowish is your frontonasal prominence. Again, first arch, so it's going to be your ophthalmic nerve, that is a part of your trigeminal. Then you have this maxillary, and then you have the mandibular. So majority of it is from the first arch. So your face is going to have your sensory nerve supply from the first pharyngeal arch nerve. That first pharyngeal arch nerve is your trigeminal nerve. So one is being supplied, your forehead portion is going to be get its sensory nerve supply by the ophthalmic. The maxillary one is getting the portion, the maxillary process is getting its nerve supply from the maxillary process, and this mandibular part is getting its supply from the mandibular nerve. But all is first arch, and first arch is your trigeminal nerve. So your respective areas, they are getting its nerve supply from the trigeminal nerve. And this picture also shows you what part different processes are giving rise to. That is, first is your the frontonasal process, the yellow, the orangish is your lateral, showing you the lateral process, which is developing into this wider portion. That is your ala of the nose, and then near the in the center is what you have as the philtrum, which is also going to give rise to the septum of the nose, or what you which separates the two nasal cavities. That is by the fused medial nasal processes. That is the portion which is inside these two white lines, and also the philtrum, that was the central depression of the upper part. And then the fused, and then you have this line of fusion of maxillary prominence and fused nasal prominences. That is the lateral part of the upper lip, and the cheek proper is being contributed by the maxillary process. And then below you have below this white line is all what you have is your mandibular prominence. So that is the mandibular nerve, and it is giving rise to your mandible plus your lower lip. So this picture gives you a very clear-cut correlation between the different, what is arising from the different parts, from the different primordia, and what nerve supply is arising from where. So this is because, just remember, it is your first, if this you see in this picture, is your first pharyngeal arch. So your first pharyngeal arch, if you don't forget, it is your trigeminal nerve, and the area is near the first pharyngeal arch that is developing, and it is the mesenchyme of the first pharyngeal arch, and then you see these arches below. Then you have this different areas which give rise to, which are produced by these different parts of these prominences, and the nerve supply which is related to it. So remember, again I repeat, the nerve supply which is arising is because of the area from where it is developing. So what if you are very in doubt about the nerve supply of that area, remember from where its origin is and what arch has its what nerve. So first is, I repeat, trigeminal, second is facial, third is your glossopharyngeal, fourth and sixth is your vagus. One branch to the fourth one, and the sixth one, then another branch of the vagus. Fifth is rudimentary. So remember, these are all going to give rise to different areas, and the area, the nerve supply is going to be by these nerves. And another thing is, if something arises from these arches, but it does not stay in its position at the very side from where it is developing, but it shifts to a position somewhere further away from its origin, still it's going to take its nerve supply along with it. So if something which is developing from the first arch shifts slightly out, it's going to take its nerve supply from the first arch, that is your trigeminal nerve. So that is the basic principle you should remember. So if we recollect the different phases, this is the different positions, how the face is developing, the 5 primordia which are arising. Then the face is developed from frontonasal process, the upper part of the forehead fold. The 2 processes, maxillary and mandibular of the first arch, the frontonasal process gives rise to the forehead and the nose. the fusion of the lateral part of the maxillary and the mandibular process, they are going to give rise to this cheek. That is, majority is by the maxillary, but the lower portion is by the mandibular. The upper lip is maxillary process on either side, and plus premaxillar part of the frontonasal processes. That is their small portion, the lower lip fusion of the two mandibular processes. Right? Then again, this picture shows you how there is the moving of these colors. So how you develop the different parts. What is the movement? What fuses with what and gives rise to what? Again, this picture shows you, and these colors, they show you what part is developing. So it is forehead, lateral part of the nose, medial nose, maxilla, and then you have the mandibular nose. So as the primordia arise, they fuse, and then ultimately you see this is the final product that you get on the face. Even if you see in this picture, that is the nasal pit is there, that gives rise to lateral nasal prominence, medial nasal prominence, then you have the stomodium, you have the maxillary fold prominences, and then you have the mandibular. These, you can see in this picture very clearly that ear starts to develop at the first arch. The first cleft is slightly lower down. So this is then ultimately going to shift upwards. So this was the position, that is the area where you had the buccopharyngeal membrane, the purplish one. It ruptures, it opens contact, that is where you develop your face or the oral cavity. This gradually these fuses and then they meet together, and this is the structure that you get. The last one, F, is what you get in the end product. So this is the list of the derivatives that you get from the different prominences of the face. The lateral nasal, showing you again the fusion and the sites where you are getting different areas are contributing. This helps you to see the nerve supply and the areas of origin. Now coming on to the clefts, that is the abnormalities which are there. Normally cleft lip is what you call as when the two processes, they do not fuse together and you see a cut. These cleft lips individually they might appear, but basically these cleft lips and are very common along with the cleft palate. That means palate which is slightly inward is going to appear both. That means if there is some divide, because we said the medial nasal and the formed as a part of the primary palate contributes to the primary palate, and then we said the maxillary process, it gives you a shelf-like projection which is going to contribute to the secondary part of the palate. So if there is some defect in these two processes, automatically we are going to have some prominences or defects in the lip prominence and also in the palate one. So you can understand now how these are two related. The development of the lip and the palate are related because their site of origin is the same. That is, they are arising from the same site. So that is why you can have a common continuity in the lip and in the face. The palate. So now if you see this small cut which is there on the upper lip. So now this is, as we know, that this is the area where the medial, the maxillary prominence meets your medial prominences, or the two medial nasal prominences, they fuse together. So this is a cleft lip, right? It's called a unilateral because it's just on one side, it's not on the other side. If you see this depression on the center, that is what we call as the philtrum. This is a unilateral, again, this is a minor one, this is a major one, that you can see that this cleft has gone deeper down and it has involved also the palate. So you can call it the cleft lip or with the cleft palate. This again that was unilateral. Again, the maxillary process and the medial nasal, they do not fuse properly. Same is the case with this. The the maxillary processes, they have not fused together. This center, the medial nasal is there, very good, neatly placed, but the maxillary process does not meet the medial nasal processes. So you have a cleft on both the sides, right, on the upper part. So that is bilateral cleft, right? This was an incomplete, then you have the bilateral. This again is medial, do not meet the maxillary process does not meet, and then you see these problems which have gone deep down and even involvement of the palate. So it is a complete. This was an incomplete one. Incomplete means it's just involvement of the lip. A complete one is when it involves the deep down into the palate. So you can see that if different processes don't fuse, it can be a unilateral one, it can just be a small nick, that is small cleft, or it can be a bilateral one, or it can be a incomplete, or this can be a complete one. That means it goes deep down in involving the palate as well. You see this again. This is the cleft lip. This has involved the jaw. If you can see that there is a gap there, that means the maxillary process is all defective, and this even in this picture, and if you see in this previous picture, there has been no development of the upper lip, plus your maxilla has not developed. So it is an incomplete, and the jaw is also absent. If you see this in this one, again the upper lip is incomplete, the lower lip is complete, and the lower jaw is complete, but this upper one is again defective. So it is incomplete, right? Same as the face. It can be a cleft lip, just the medial maxillary processes, they have not fused together properly, and you have a cleft lip. It's just in the lip, the rest deeper down structures, they are fused. It can be a cleft jaw. That means it has just involved the jaw along with the lip. And this is the palate has also been involved deeper down. So the upper lip is involved, the jaw is involved, and the palate is involved, because this is because you have a common origin. The common origin, we have palate as 2 points of origin, primary and secondary. Primary is contributed by the medial nasal prominences, and the maxillary prominence contributes to the secondary one. So that is why when you talk about the development of the palate, you will understand how this is correlated. So when one defect is there, it is going to be interrelated, and all of it is going to be continuously defective information. So it is just a cleft lip, that is a superficial one. This is the bone is also involved, it is the bone is also defective, and this the palate is also defective. So it's going deep down inside. If you see again in these pictures, this also the bone was involved and the lip was involved. This is the bone is also involved. This was just a nick in the lip, and you can see this is the involvement of the palate, and this is whole of the both the sides. It's a bilateral and a complete one. This is a midline cleft lip. If you see in the center, it's just one. That means the two sides of the median nasal processes, they have not fused with each other, and this is what we call as the median or the midline cleft lip. This is oblique facial cleft lip. This oblique facial cleft lip is on the side coming from. Now this is basically involving the area where you have your duct which is connecting your nose with the eye. That is your nasolacrimal duct. We talk about that is what we call it is defective. That means your maxillary process has not fused with the lateral nasal process. There it is leaving that area open, and this is the area where you have your development of the nasolacrimal duct, that is from the eye to the lateral part of the nose. That was your inferior meatus of the nose and the lacrimal sac, if you remember your lacrimal apparatus. So that connects your lacrimal sac from the medial angle of the eye to the lateral wall of the nose in the inferior meatus. That is your nasolacrimal duct. That nasolacrimal duct is going to develop in this portion. So if that is defective, it is going to result what we call as the oblique facial cleft. Automatically doing the face, we have done the development of the nose, frontonasal prominence. The frontal one gives rise to the forehead, the nasal, the dorsum of the nose, and the apex of the nose. That is all contributed by the facial prominence. Fourth week पे surface ectoderm, you have the, how does it start to develop? You have the nasal praecord, primordium of the nose. That is the introlateral part of your frontal nasal prominence. Then depression in the placoid, margins, mesenchyme proliferate from the medial and the lateral nasal prominences. In the center, you have this depression, which is the nasal pit or the anterior nares of the nasal cavity. Maxillary prominence proliferate from the side, it pushes the medial prominences to midline to meet, and you get the dorsum plus the nasal septum, nasolacrimal groove. This is going to separate between the lateral nasal prominence and the maxillary prominence. Later they merge and the ala of the nose is formed and the cheek is formed. So if you see this, the ala of the nose is going to form and the cheek of the nose. Now if you see how the nasolacrimal duct is formed, this is the area nasolacrimal duct is forming. If you see in this nasolacrimal groove, this is the area where your maxillary process is fusing with your lateral nasal prominences. Now these gradually, when the maxilla is pushing the lateral nasal prominences forward, this is gradually meeting upward to the lateral nasal prominences, the maxilla. This is then covering the surface. The surface is open. This is what you form as the nasolacrimal groove. This nasolacrimal groove then covers on the top, and then you have a solid, in the mesenchymal process, you have a solid cord-like structure which is extending from the lateral wall of the nose to the eye. That is what we are going to develop into the lacrimal sac. This then closes, separates this mesenchymal rod-like structure which is deeper down in this area. This separates and the surface ectoderm covers the upper portion. This solid rod is then ultimately going to become canalized, and this canalization is going to give rise to your nasolacrimal duct extending above. The dilatation is going to be called as your lacrimal sac, and this is going to open into your lateral wall of the nose or the inferior meatus of the nose, that is the nasolacrimal duct. Okay. So nasolacrimal groove separates the lateral nasal prominence and the maxillary prominence. If you see in this, later they merge, ala of the nose is going to be formed and the cheek and the nasolacrimal groove. Nasolacrimal duct, the ectoderm on the surface is going to thicken. In the groove, this groove, the floor is there, it becomes solid. This then canalizes, and this is the nasolacrimal duct and the surface ectoderm that is going to cover it and close the upper surface, and just the mesenchyme below is going to close the solid canal which is there, and that's going to form the solid canal. It canalizes, that means that it becomes a lumen. This nasolacrimal duct is going to link up with the cranial end, the eye, that is the lacrimal sac, and caudal opals in the lateral wall of the nose. Right? So this is the continuation between the formation of the nasolacrimal groove. And when this remains open, this is going to give rise to this oblique facial cleft. This was the area. So maxillary is fusing with the lateral nasal. When this is going to cover it with the ectoderm, deeper down the mesenchyme going to proliferate, form a rod-like structure. This is first solid and then it is going to become canalized. That means it's going to become hollow. This extends upwards to the lacrimal sac in the eye and below into the lateral wall of the nose. And so this is your what we call as the nasolacrimal duct. If this groove or this position is open, you get oblique facial clefts. The abnormalities of the nose can be, there can be absence of the nose, that is no placoid can be formed, single nostril, only one nasal placoid can be formed, or it can be a bifid. That means the medial nasal swellings do not merge, that means the two are separate. Then is the development of the nasal cavity. That was the outer nose that is formed. This is the nasal pit that is there, which had on the sides the formation was your medial and the lateral prominences. This bit is going to deepen down. Above you can see that you have the wall of the brain, and this is above the oral cavity. So below this you have the oral cavity, and this is the development of the tongue. And this is the oropharyngal membrane that is separating the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. If you see in this picture, the development of the pit goes on deeper. The oral cavity is developing. This then there is the breaking down of this oronasal membrane which separates the nasal cavity from the oronasal membrane. So that means your oral cavity and your nasal cavity becomes one. The upper portion of this is going to develop into its sensory portion. This wall is going to be related with the in the brain as the olfactory bulb. That is where you have the brain. In that is the olfactory nerve, which is this upper part is going to give your sensory nerve terminals, which are there. That is the olfaction, that is smell, nerve terminals of the smell. The rest is your general sensation. This is the area where you're going to have the receptors for the smell, and this they're going to be connected with the olfactory bulb. This is the then in the center, this blue portion is going to develop into the primary palate. So it's separating the nose from the oral cavity. This is the primitive choana, that is there is the opening, because the nose posteriorly, how do you get a medicine that you put in your eyes, how does that go, or in the nose, how does that go in your oral cavity? This is because posteriorly your oral cavity is linked, it goes on to the pharynx. You know that you've studied pharynx. Pharynx has three components: the nasal, the oral, and the laryngeal component. So they are all connected. If you put something in one cavity, it's going to go down into the oral and ultimately down in pharynx into the oral cavity. So this is the primitive choanae. That means on the posterior end. This was initially very in the anterior position, but gradually as it develops, the palate, you can see the primary palate is developing, that is the blue one. Then gradually your secondary palate is developing. So your nasal cavity is deepening down posteriorly. As it deepens down your cavity, also the nasal cavity also goes posteriorly. On the lateral wall, you can see the concas are developing, sepral. The this primitive choanae, that is the link between the oral cavity and the nasal cavity, was initially in front, but then gradually as this primary and secondary palate develop, they take this opening posteriorly. So that is where you have your definitive choanae, that is your definitive opening from the nasal cavity to the pharynx. So initially it was in front, then gradually it goes down backward, and this is where you are developing your maxilla, and then you have your mandible, and this is the palate in between. So this is how, by the deepening of your nasal pit, that you are developing the chamber of the nasal cavity, right? So nasal cavity, you have your nasal pits, nostrils, nasal sacs, anterior aperture. Nasal and oral cavity are separated as I've shown by the oronasal membrane. Primitive choana membrane ruptures common cavity you become. Then secondary palate pushes the choana posteriorly. As the secondary palate develops, the opening connection between the oral cavity and the nasal cavity is pushed backwards. Nasal septum develops two nasal passages, definitive choana, posterior nasal aperture, pharynx. Then you develop into the superior, middle, and then inferior concha. Then the olfactory epithelium develops, and this is all by the Bowmer's organ of Jackson. This develops in the nasal septum. That is where you have the sense of smell, right? So that is how the nose is developed. So you see that between the maxillary and that lateral nasal is the groove, which is called as the nasolacrimal groove. This merges, and then deep down it's going to form your nasolacrimal duct. This duct is going to open at one end because of the fusion between the lateral nasal and the maxillary. At one end it is opening into the eye as a nasal lacrimal sac, and below into the lateral wall of the nose. This becomes your nasolacrimal duct. And if this duct is open superiorly, it is going to give rise to what we call as the oblique facial cleft, that is placed on one side, and this is where you have the exposure of your nasal groove. So, so you can have three levels. It can be just be a cleft lip, it can be a cleft jaw, that means jaw can be involved, and it can be the involvement of the palate as well. So commonly what you see is that is there is the involvement of from in front to the back. That means the palate is also involved. The defect is there if there is a major defect. So recollecting what all is forming from where. See, the initial arise, gradually they're meeting, and this is what you get, the position. I'm just recollecting all what is there, showing you the different diagrams, what is developing. Abnormalities can be no nose, no nasal plaque develops, single nostril, only one nasal plaque develops, bifid nose, medial nasal swellings don't merge. Talk about the nasal sinuses in the left class, or let's go to or let's give it so that we finish this portion. The paranasal sinuses that develop late fetal life, it's just the maxillary sinus which is developed. Others after birth. The maxillary sinus is the first one which is going to develop before birth, otherwise, and it's a small one, but others have developed from the diverticle of the walls of the nasal cavities and become pneumatic. Maxillary sinus, maxilla, and the frontal sinuses, frontal bones, they give extensions from the walls of the nose opening the persist as orifices of the adult sinuses. They are rudimentary at birth, grow slow. At puberty, they are full grown. All permanent teeth have erupted. That is why your shape of the face changes. As the teeth have erupted, the mandible grows in size and the paranasal sinuses have formed. I told you when we talked about the changes in the skull after the formation after birth. These that is important. Alteration of or shape of the face in infancy and childhood and giving resonance to the voice. So remember, maxillary sinus is the only sinus which is present at birth, rests, and afterwards, and they're very small and they're very rudimentary. So postnatal development of paranasal sinuses is most are rudimentary, that is there or absent in the newborn. Rudimentary means they're very small in size or they're absent in the newborn infants. The maxillary sinus is small at birth, grows slowly until puberty, and fully development when all the permanent teeth are erupted. There is no frontal sinus, no sphenoidal sinus at birth. Ethmoidal sinus is small before the age of 2 years, grow rapidly afterwards. Age forming a frontal sinus visible in the radiographs at the 7th week. So at 6th, 7th week, you can see all these sinuses which have formed. 2 years forming two sphenoidal air sinus starting from the second year. The growth of paranasal sinuses is important in how in altering the shape and size of the face during infancy and childhood and adding resonance to the voice during adolescence. So roughly at the age of 6 to 7 years or nearing adolescence, these sinuses increase and they said there's two functions: lighten the skull and they add resonance to the voice, and also they change the shape which was there from the infancy and gradually going on. So the change, the developments which occur is the permanent teeth and the formation of the paranasal sinuses which develop, which make the dimensions of the face change after birth. That is how the looks and the appearance of the face changes, and that is because of these two things which are not there initially. Next will be your palette. We will be starting, inshallah, the next class.